Hello, in this video, I'm going to talk about augmented feedback. So feedback in general, we're talking about information received about performance of a motor skill during or after the performance. So there are two types of feedback overall, task-intrinsic feedback and augmented feedback. So task-intrinsic feedback is the sensory feedback that is naturally available while performing a skill. So without any observer or anyone to communicate with you, it is simply the feedback that you receive while performing a skill via touch, proprioception, vision, or auditory feedback. So it's your own experience in your body of performing that skill and your ability to detect whether you performed it correctly. Augmented feedback is referring to additional feedback. So augmented as in added on, new extra feedback. So it's information about a performance that supplements sensory feedback and comes from a source external to the performer. So it's also referred to as external feedback or task-extrinsic feedback. So it's adding to or enhancing your own sensory feedback from what you're experiencing during the task. So there are two types of augmented feedback. So knowledge of results or KR feedback and knowledge of performance or KP feedback. So KR is information about the result or the outcome of performing the skill. So it could be just a simple yes or no, like did you achieve the goal? It could be a lot more complex, and there could be more information about how much error occurred, compared to what the goal was. So like an example is in archery, the coach might say the shot was in the blue at 9 o'clock. So to indicate how far off you were and in which direction so that the person could correct for that error and hopefully get closer to the target. Knowledge of performance or KP, that's where you're providing feedback about the movement characteristics of the performance itself. So information about the components of the movement that were part of the skill performance. So in the same example in archery, KP feedback would be like you pulled the bow to the left at the release of the arrow. Okay, so KR, it's like, here's what the result was, here's what happened. KP is more like, here's what your body did, here's how you could correct that. So you pulled the bow to the left at the release of the arrow. So it gives more information about how to actually correct the error. So then the question is augmented feedback necessary for someone to learn motor skills? So the answer really is it depends on the type of skill. So there are 4 scenarios that yes, it's necessary, no, it's not necessary, it will help, but isn't technically necessary, or it will get in the way, it's bad. So there's 4 scenarios. So yes, it is necessary in certain situations. So like where the sensory feedback isn't available. So like maybe they can't see the target, or for whatever reason, they're not able to perceive themselves whether they successfully completed the goal. That could also be in the case of like rehabilitation, if sensory pathways aren't available, like maybe someone is recovering from a stroke or any kind of injury where maybe there's something interfering with sensory pathways. In that case, augmented feedback is going to be necessary for that person to know how they did and whether they executed the skill correctly. It also could be, even if sensory feedback is fully available and intact, if a beginner doesn't have enough experience to know whether that feedback means that they did it right or not, then they're going to need augmented feedback. So maybe the person fully knows and can feel and see everything in their bodies, but they still may not know if they did it right due to lack of experience. So in that case, augmented feedback is necessary. Augmented feedback is not necessary for tasks where the task-intrinsic feedback is sufficient. So for a task where you fully can see and experience whether the skill was performed correctly or not, and whether the goal was achieved, then you don't need augmented feedback. And the augmented feedback actually could, in that case, interfere with the learning of the task. So like if you're doing a task where like maybe you're pushing a button and the light turns on, but you have to push the correct button at the correct time or something like that, you'll have immediate feedback whether the light turns on or not. about whether you executed that skill correctly. And so with each trial, you can calibrate your movements or which button you push or whatever it is. You can calibrate according to the instant task-intrinsic feedback that you're getting without anybody adding extra feedback. Then the third scenario is that the skill can essentially be learned without augmented feedback, but at some point in the learning process, to be able to improve further, to get to a higher level of learning, then the augmented feedback is necessary. So like, for example, if we're trying to move as fast as possible, that's the movement goal, is to move more quickly. In earlier stages, the learner will be able to tell whether they are moving more quickly or not. So the task intrinsic feedback will be adequate for them to tell if they are achieving that goal of going faster. But as they become more advanced at achieving that goal, the changes, the improvements will be so much smaller that they will need some kind of augmented feedback to detect the difference. So they'll need to measure their time or have someone there that's comparing and providing feedback. So in that case, it wasn't necessary to work on that motor skill, but there's sort of a ceiling to how much improvement can take place without augmented feedback. And then that augmented feedback can help you move beyond that barrier. And then the last scenario is when augmented feedback actually gets in the way of skill learning. So it works against you. Now, the biggest problem here is if a beginner becomes dependent on that augmented feedback, then they will actually perform worse without it than they would had they never had the feedback in the first place. So we don't want a beginner to become dependent on augmented feedback to be able to execute that skill correctly. So this scenario is most likely when the task intrinsic feedback is minimal or difficult to detect or interpret. So like you can't see the target, or it's difficult to be able to interpret what you're seeing or experiencing and be able to figure out if that means you did it right or wrong. So it's most likely to happen in that case, because then they're more likely to receive more augmented feedback and more likely to become dependent on it. So it's more likely to occur if the augmented feedback they're receiving is erroneous. So if they're getting bad feedback, then it's going to interfere with skill learning. And then they're more likely to become dependent on that feedback if the feedback is presented while the person is performing the skill. So if while the person is performing the skill again and again, they're receiving feedback during the performance of that skill, they're more likely to become dependent on that feedback, which will interfere with their actual learning of the skill, because they won't have to learn to detect and listen to their own cues and their own task intrinsic feedback, because they'll be dependent on that external feedback. And then it also happens when augmented feedback is given too frequently during practice. So during the movement and or too frequently throughout practice, they're more likely to become dependent on it. So when we look at the content of augmented feedback and what we should be focusing on, there are a few different things to consider. So first is error versus correct performance feedback. So when we give augmented feedback, should we be focusing on telling them what they did wrong to correct, or focusing on what they did right to encourage? And so which one we should focus on really depends on the goal of what you're doing with that person. Focusing on error-related information is far more effective if you're trying to teach someone the skill. So if the goal is to facilitate the skill acquisition, then they need to know what they did wrong so that they can work on correcting those errors. If the goal is motivation, then you want to focus on what they did correctly. Okay, so it depends on what the goal is. If the person you're working with, if the real issue is that they need to be motivated and stay in a positive headspace, like maybe during rehabilitation or something where their motivation to continue is the most critical aspect, then focus on what they did right. If it's a situation like in sports or where they're trying to learn a new skill and getting it right and learning the new skill correctly is the most important, then focus on error-related information. Next is, should we focus on KP or KR type of feedback? So knowledge of performance or knowledge of result feedback. So both are helpful and useful in different situations. Knowledge of performance feedback tends to be more broadly applicable in most situations, but there are times when you want either or both. So KR helps learners to confirm their own assessment. So like, let's say the person practices the skill and they feel like they did really well that time. Then giving them KR feedback is going to help them confirm whether they did do really well or not in terms of the result of the movement. And so it helps them sort of calibrate their own understanding of what was good performance and what wasn't in terms of what resulted in the outcome that they wanted. It also helps them determine the outcome of performing the skill, motivates to continue practicing. So maybe they did a great job on that one and you give them the feedback about the result, and it could be really motivating that, wow, we're improving, you're doing better, great job, or you almost had it, let's go a little faster on this next one, that sort of thing. And it also, KR feedback can help work on a trial and error approach. So like we think back to that archery example where you give the feedback about where the arrow landed, then through trial and error, the person can correct their movement with trial and error to see what gets closer to the bullseye compared to what they did the last time. And it also helps the learner adopt an external focus, which we know in terms of where we pay attention, we are going to do better if we are focusing on the outcome and the goal of the movement rather than our actual internal focus of our movements themselves. So it helps them work on an external focus. KP, knowledge of performance feedback, is good when the movement characteristics themselves are really the result. That's what the performance is. So like in archery, it's not about the actual movement, it's about the result. Where did the arrow land? Okay, in something like gymnastics, it's the movement itself that is the performance, that is really the result. And so giving knowledge of performance feedback about something where the movement characteristic itself is what counts, is more useful. It also can be useful to help improve complex coordination of specific movement components. So think about a tennis serve. It's complicated. There are a lot of moving parts and joints that need to be in the right place. And so in complex coordination situations, the KP could be more helpful. And it also can be helpful to help produce a specific kinematic, kinetic, or muscle activity profile. So like in center of mass, rehabilitation type things where you're on force plates and seeing how you're moving your center of mass during different activities, that sort of thing. Okay, and then qualitative or quantitative. So should the feedback we give be quantitative, meaning like you're giving a numerical value about speed or degrees of range of motion or something else? Or should it be qualitative, like descriptive and talking about the quality of the performance, like that was faster, that was better, you need to bend the knee more, those sorts of comments. So the answer here is it depends on the stage of learning. So in earlier stages of learning, learners are going to benefit more from qualitative feedback. So qualitative feedback is less specific. It's a little bit more general and helps the learner understand if they're in the ballpark of what they need to do. So it's like for a beginner, it may not mean anything to them if you say you need 10 more degrees of flexion in the knee. Like that may not, they may not be able to even connect to that because they're so early in learning what the movement is like. But if you say you need to bend that knee more, or that was really good, but maybe try to do that a little bit faster. Like those sorts of qualitative, more generic feedback are more useful in the beginning when they're just trying to get in the ballpark of what they should be doing. Versus at a more advanced learner who's more advanced at that skill, they're not worried about the ballpark. They know they're in the ballpark and that they're generally doing it correctly, but they need more fine detail about exactly what they need to change or do or how they performed to be able to enhance their performance or be able to achieve at a higher level. So in that case, you might say something like, you need 3 more degrees of extension in that knee, or, maybe that's too fine a point, but they're going to benefit more from, the difference in seconds when you record their speed, or whatever kind of quantitative feedback is going to be more useful to them, because they have the experience and the context to understand what that means and how to apply it. And that's going to help them to just edge their performance up little by little. Then the error size. So when we are providing augmented feedback, we want to be careful about how often we do that. And I'll talk about that in another video. So we want to be careful about frequency of providing feedback and how much feedback that we're giving. So using performance bandwidth is a helpful strategy. That's where you sort of decide, here's the range of error in this performance that is acceptable. And if the error becomes greater than that range, then I'm going to give feedback about that error. And so that can be a helpful way, so that you're not giving feedback on every single attempt, that you're only giving feedback when the error is great enough. But what's important here is that the learner knows that that's the strategy, because if they don't know that, then they may be thinking that anytime you don't give feedback, it means they did it correctly, or that it was a perfect attempt. So they need to understand that when they're within this certain range, there's no feedback. So it doesn't mean they did it perfectly necessarily, but it means that the error was small enough that you're not reporting on it, that you're only going to report on it or give that feedback when that error is outside of a certain range. So it's important that they know that that's what you're doing. Otherwise, they may expect that they're not hearing feedback, therefore this was perfect, and it could reinforce certain errors that they might be making because they assume that it was correct. All right, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great day.